Hey, look out. It's Faith Talk Live. I'm Rick Probst.
And I'm Dan Ratcliffe.
What a pleasure to talk to journalist Collin Hansen. He's got a brand new book out. It is out today, and you'll want to pick it up. It's Timothy Keller, His Spiritual and Intellectual Formation. Collin, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. How are you guys?
We are doing well. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. And when I got this from the publicist, I thought, well, of course, we all know who Timothy Keller is and have read his books or listened to his audio books. But I thought, okay, why would a journalist write a book about Timothy Keller? Now, let's start there. Why Timothy Keller?
Well, I've known Tim for a good number of years. We go back to our ministry together through the Gospel Coalition. I started there in 2010. He co-founded our ministry. Tim is simply, when you look back on the 20th century, 21st century, one of the most significant global Christian leaders through his leadership at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, co-founding the Gospel Coalition, being chairman and co-founder of Redeemer City to City, a global church planting ministry, all his best-selling New York Times best-selling books, his top podcast, all that sort of stuff. But I think for readers, what is so interesting and what I was intrigued by was going back and seeing with how many people his life has intersected. A lot of listeners probably familiar with Elizabeth Elliot, famous teacher. She was one of Tim's professors and was close with him. A lot of people obviously have heard of C.S. Lewis. Well, people may not realize that Tim's wife, Kathy, was one of the last people to correspond with Lewis before he died in November of 1963. 9/11, of course, the attacks. You can see why a journalist would be interested.
Yeah. And Tim, every time I think of Tim Keller, he's one of the guys that whenever I need a good quote for a sermon or just, teaching or whatever, I can always count on Tim Keller, C.S. Lewis, Charles Spurgeon. But Tim Keller is in that group of people. It's just like some of the things he says is just like, wow, that's awesome. I mean, he's just one of those guys.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is his unique ability to be able to talk to people with really high-level intellectual interests, but also the rest of us just ordinary folks. And part of that's his own biography. So the first 9 years coming out of seminary, he was a pastor of a small church in Hopewell, Virginia. We're talking only 2 members of the congregation had a college degree at all. They were elementary school teachers. Most people didn't have beyond 6th grade education. He preached 1,500 sermons in 9 years in that setting where their parents, their dads had fought in the Civil War. I mean, that's a pretty wild situation there. That's not the Tim Keller most people will think of when they think of the pastor in New York City and preaching at the 5-year anniversary with President Bush of the 9/11 attacks in New York City, things like that. None do they think of, but that's who they'll get to meet in this book.
Tim Keller is the book. We're talking to the author, journalist Collin Hansen, and that data that you just gave me, that fact with him pastoring the church for 9 years, just shows his heart too, because he could have blew up and blew out and become Tim Keller, but he decided to stay and to really minister to those people and love them. And you talk, Collin, about a number of things that just had impact on his life. I didn't realize that he had a brother that died of AIDS in the 90s. That of course would affect you as well. Talk a little bit about that.
It would, yeah. His brother Billy. So I got to talk with their sister Sharon, and was a great help to the book. One of the first people that I talked to there, and that's one of the unique contributions of the book. Nobody else, as far as I've ever seen, has talked with these family members. And so, yes, Tim's younger brother Billy died in 1998 of AIDS, and one of the, I think maybe the kind of the climax of this book is going back to that funeral in 1998. And of course, his older brother, Tim, would be the one who preached it. And I want people to go check it out for themselves. But if you think, what would Tim Keller preach at his younger brother's funeral? Well, you put 2 and 2 together, you realize it's the parable of the 2 brothers, the prodigal son, Luke 15, probably his most famous message. And that's where it got its start, was preaching at the funeral of his younger brother who came to faith in hospice, when finally the concept of grace just clicked for him after a lifetime of not understanding it. You can see why it's pretty. I got the notes from that sermon. As far as I know, nobody's ever seen him before.
My gracious.
Collin, do you talk in the book all about his recent illness and battle with, I believe it's cancer that he's battling
Yeah,
with?
so still with pancreatic cancer. I mean, that was part of our motivation with this project. He got that diagnosis in May of 2020, and we just didn't know how much time we had left.
Mhm.
It's pancreatic cancer. We know how that goes.
Right.
There's no known cure. So, but here we are a couple years later, and praise God. I mean, he's still ministering and still active and still writing and still publishing books, and hopefully he'll be doing that for a long time. But the thing about Tim is he is a lifelong learner. I mean, I don't know how. I mean, if I knew that I had this terminal illness, I'm not sure how I spend my time. But knowing Tim, I'm not as surprised that he loves hanging out with his wife Kathy in New York and reading books.
Yeah.
That sounds like Tim.
Collin Hansen, talking about Tim Keller. He knows Tim personally, just wrote a book. It's out today. You can get it. Timothy Keller, His Spiritual and Intellectual Formation. As you began, now you said before we started, or maybe in the beginning, you talked about that you've known Tim for a long, long time.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you found out that really surprised you in a sense? I don't mean in a bad way, but it's just like, wow, I'd have never thought, you fill in the blank.
Yeah. Well, I found that the people who are close to Tim, they don't idolize him. And it's not because they don't admire him. I would have this experience where I talked to somebody who's known him for a really long time, and they would cry. They would weep these tears of just thankfulness for God's work in their lives through him. And then they'd see me writing down notes, and then they'd say, "But don't you make him out to be a saint." There were a lot of things that went wrong out there. But the difference with Tim is that he's open about them. I mean, this is a book that he worked with me on, and yet it's a book that talks about his difficulties as a manager, a lot of the problems that he had. I mean, just imagine starting a church in New York City in the 1980s. It grows to thousands within a few years.
Mhm.
And then 9/11 attacks. It grows by another like 800 to 900 regular members.
Wow.
That would tax anybody's leadership skills. And Tim is a tremendous leader, not a great manager. That's not unique among pastors.
Right.
But I think it's actually an encouragement to the rest of us as leaders to think not everybody's good at everything. We can be honest about our sin and our shortcomings.
That's good.
Yeah, and I think the Bible talks about that, right? That we're not all going to be good at everything, right?
That's what Jesus is for.
Yeah. Well, looking at on the website, timothykellerbook.com, you have a list of books, a reading list to understand Tim Keller. There's some heavy stuff on there.
No doubt about it. Well, just in case you're done with these 300 pages and you want to read a few thousand more, we got some books out there. The way to think about Tim is like a large oak tree. You slice it open and you can see these rings. And the thing is, when you come to the core rings, it's Jesus, obviously. It's God's word. And then you mentioned earlier, it's Charles Spurgeon, it's George Whitefield, it's John Stott, it's J.I. Packer, it's Martin Lloyd-Jones. It's a lot of these classic teachers throughout the 1970s. He didn't have hardly any money because he didn't get paid much in a rural church in Virginia in the 1970s.
Right.
So for Christmas, they'd give him a bunch of Puritan paperback, little cheap books, and he'd put them on the steering wheel and drive around town while he was reading them. I guess an early version of looking at your phone.
Yeah.
Like reading Puritan paperbacks while driving.
That's funny right there. That's funny.
But I mean, that's so in many, yes, you can then add later these 900-page works on social criticism by Charles Taylor, A Secular Age. That's great stuff, but that's on the outer rings that he developed in his 50s and 60s and 70s. It's not the inner rings of that other work that I think many of us have found profitable.
Yeah.
Collin Hansen, the book is called Timothy Keller, Spiritual and Intellectual Formation. And we're not even scratching the surface on what is in this book. You got to check this book out. Would love to get a copy of it and check it out. Pick up yours today. It is out. And Collin, as you worked with, because you've known Timothy, you worked with him on this particular book. Has he come to terms, as he wrapped his brain around the fact that he is like an icon of sorts?
Yeah.
I mean, because you say Timothy Keller, most people know who that is.
Right.
How does he feel about that? He's like, that's something I just want to get away from, or how does he feel about that?
He largely pretends like it doesn't exist. The first line of the book is something along the lines of the first 10,000 people he meets in New York, nobody has any idea who he is. That's a line from Kathy, his wife. They're as close as any couple I've ever known, including in ministry. And I don't know if that's true. I will say it does help to be in New York if you're a leading Christian figure, because it's not the same as being in Atlanta or
Right.
Birmingham where I am, or Nashville, right?
Right.
I mean, it's just larger and much more secular. So in that sense, it's not entirely surprising. But the reason I framed it that way is to indicate their self-understanding. This is not a church that has promoted itself over the years. They've wanted to reach their skeptical urban neighbors who don't really pay much attention to what's happening in Atlanta or
Yeah.
Birmingham or Nashville or anywhere, west of the Hudson. So
Yeah.
that it just that's and really going all the way back, Tim and Kathy both describe themselves as pretty nerdy. Tim's a marching band guy. Kathy's a newspaper editor kind of
Marching
person.
band. I knew there was something I loved about Tim Keller.
Yeah,
He was in
yeah,
marching
so
band like
trumpet
me.
player, drum
All right.
major. So they just kind of always thought of themselves as the overlooked, kind of quiet, nerdy folks. And so I wouldn't say that fame and attention comes very natural to them. I mean, they moved into the same apartment in 1989 and haven't left since.
Wow.
I mean, it's just they kind of like those rhythms there. They don't love the attention. But one reason why he agreed to work on the book is because it's using that occasion to talk about all these other people that he's learned from. That's, I think, the unique aspect of this book.
Wow, love it. Collin Hansen, journalist and author with Timothy Keller. Timothy Keller, the book, His Spiritual and Intellectual Formation. Collin, we'd love to talk to you again. I mean, like I said, we've just begun and we've got to go to a break, but it's just some really good stuff. Don't forget about, or I didn't mention this earlier, but I do want to mention it's the Gospel Bound podcast that Collin has, and you can listen to that wherever you get your podcast. You can also check out the book at timothykellerbook.com. We got to take a break. Thank you so much, Collin. We appreciate you. We'll be right back. I'm Rick Probst.
And I'm Dan Ratcliffe.
This is Faith Talk Live.